Welcome to January. Congratulations, you all survived 2018. Give yourselves a big pat on the back. There you go, good job. So we're finding ourselves in January again. Hopefully you grabbed a bulletin on your way in because there's a little note in there for me. If you didn't, grab it on your way out. So in January, we are celebrating Sabbath once again this year. So if you've been with us for a while, in January and August every year, we take a church Sabbath, which is a chance for us to take a break from the things that we normally do. It gives our small group leaders and our youth group leaders a chance to step back for a little bit, maybe plan for what's up and coming, not have to have their house clean and full of people once a week, or have to come down here once a week and run youth group, and just spend some time relaxing and rejuvenating, praying about where God would take us in the future, and things like that. And so it's just our way as a church to kind of get in this habit that God has given us to take a break, to have the strength to restart again. We do this in August, so we have a break right before school starts, then we can kind of start everything all at once in that September season of starting things up, and we take a break in January because we're all exhausted from Christmas. How many people are exhausted from Christmas? Me too. Rachel and I welcomed our new baby niece this week on Tuesday, very early Tuesday morning. She was the first baby of the South Shore Hospital. She was on the front page of the Patriot Ledger in South Boston. And we Kishes like to make it in the paper, but Kensington has really one-upped us all because on the day she was born, she was on the front page in a color picture. So she is already an overachiever. Not that that's surprising if you know Sam and Kayla. So after we drove for about 20 hours back from Chicago, and we got back late last Saturday night, early Tuesday morning, Rachel and I and my parents drove all the way down to Boston and all the way back up in one day, and we are just ready to be done driving for a little while. So we're ready for some Sabbath this year. So if you were with us last January, you'll remember we preached through a 4 or 5 part message series on Sabbath and what that meant and what God's plan for us was. So last year, let me just briefly recap our themes from last year if you weren't with us. Yeah? You can do it, I believe in you. Last year the theme was this, that Sabbath is a time for us to be deeply in connection with God. We had this discussion of how so often when we talk about Sabbath, it becomes just this list of do's and don'ts. And as we look at especially the Jewish religion, it got to the point where their Sabbaths were so structured that this many paces was considered work, and you couldn't go that many paces. And you could go to another house if it did or didn't have a fence because one was considered work, and it went on. And so often we get so busy with remembering what the rules are that we forget what Sabbath is actually all about. And so last year the focus was, what is Sabbath really about? And it is really about relationship with God. You remember the primary image, if you were here for the first week, we started with this huge pile of chores, and there were dirty dishes and mops and brooms and vacuums and all of those things that we have waiting for us at home that need to be done. How many people have chores to be done at the house? Yep, I forgot to start the dishwasher before I came to church, so we have a dishwasher full of dirty dishes. Sorry if I just reminded anybody else, right? But that's kind of what happens with Sabbath. There's all these things that we have to do, and we have to figure out, well, how do I rest, but also not have a house that's a mess? And all of these sorts of things. We have to take people here and do this, and in the balance of, well, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to not do? And we forget what Sabbath is really about. You'll remember last year the opening message of this series. About halfway through, we had this very talented and capable group of people that came in a few moments, transformed that pile of do's and don'ts and chores and not chores into a beautiful candlelit dinner setting, which is really the environment that Sabbath is to be. That it's not about what things are we supposed to do or not do. It's about intentionally spending time with God. It is like going on a date with our Lord. It is that time, and we talked about how it's so important in any kind of romantic relationship to have time set apart to spend with one another, to invest in the relationship and to build the relationship. We also talked about how in my marriage, and probably in yours as well, sometimes date night is doing laundry. Because you say, we've got no money to go out to dinner, and we really have to get this done, but we so need time together. And so you find a way to make that work. A thing that we do in our house is this thing called phases that Rachel and I like to do, and we started doing it with our kids where we each get to pick one thing, and we'll do like 20 minutes of one thing, and then of what I pick, and then 20 minutes of what Rachel picks, and some of those are like do the laundry or clean the kitchen. Usually we'll try to make it fun, like we'll put music on and dance as we clean or something like that. No, there aren't any videos of it, sorry. And then we'll have some fun stuff, like we'll play a game, and sometimes date night looks like that, right? Say, yep. Sometimes date night looks like, sometimes as a married couple, and you know this, sometimes you have to just make the best of it and say, you know what, we're going to intentionally spend time with one another while also doing these things that we need to do. But you also recognize that sometimes you really do need to just get away. And so last year we were really seeking the heart of Sabbath being relationship with Jesus and with our Father, and taking that time to spend with Him. Because it is more Sabbath to have a busy day full of God's Spirit than to have just a lazy day at home that you're not talking to Him, right? We talked about this idea of how Sabbath is also not just doing whatever it is that you want. And so if you take your Sabbath and you just watch TV all day, and you're not in the Word, and you're not in prayer, and you never give God a chance to speak with you, that is less Sabbath than if you're busy and working all day, but you're allowing God to speak, and you're saying, you know what, God, I've got all these things that have to get done today, but Lord, let me be open to your voice and your presence throughout this day. So that was last year. Last year, we were after the heart of what Sabbath really was, all right? Now, this year, we're going to take the next step, and we're going to look a lot more practically, okay? This year, we're going to look more at how we are supposed to do it. It's going to be more action-oriented, and we're going to discover and seek after what God really wants us to do on Sabbath. Now, something I'm going to talk about today, we might talk about it for a couple weeks now. I don't know how much we'll come back to it. But I want to talk about something called the water bottle principle. All right, this is something that I made up, and I've come up with in trying to discover really the way people interact with other people. And it's this idea that's come into my head called the water bottle principle. And here's what it is. All right, here we have a bottle of water. Right, Brooklyn? Can you say water? You want it? No? You want it? So here we have a bottle of water. Now let's say we have a little baby like Brooklyn. You going to help Daddy with the sermon today? Say, yep. Yep, okay. Oh, thank you, Pumpkin. Now you'll notice Brooklyn really wants to drink some of this water. Let's say Brooklyn is really, really thirsty, and she really wants some water. Now she is aware, even as young as she is, because she's really smart, right? That what is in that bottle is what she desires right now. She is aware that, no, you can't leave with it.
She's also aware that Mommy will open it for her.
Yes, she is, which is exactly my point. Good, we have backups. More backups. So Brooklyn is aware that what is in this water bottle is what she needs. And in fact, if she is thirsty, if her body is in need of water, if she's dehydrated, what is in this water bottle is exactly what she needs. Now, here's the problem. Brooklyn is not able to open these water bottles. Now, she's getting close. She's starting to try to open things. Emma knows how to open everything in the world, including baby gates. Brooklyn is not quite there yet. And so we have this dilemma that she could sit here with this all day, and she can look at it. She can think about how good the water will taste. She can think about how much that water will help her. She can understand the degree to which she needs that water in order to make her not be thirsty anymore. But you realize that there's a disconnect if she cannot actually open it. Now, what initially got me thinking about this concept, and you can apply this to a number of areas in our lives, what initially got me thinking about this is people that claim to have love for another person, but there's no evidence of it, right? And so we see this often in our lives, that we come across people that come to us and they say that they love us and they say that they care about us, but we don't experience any of that. And they don't do the things that a person who loves us does, and they don't interact with us the way a person who loves us interacts with us. They don't lay themselves down for us the way a person who loves us lays themselves down for us. And so often what we are led to is the conclusion that that person is lying about how they feel about us. And that's a very difficult place for us to be, because we say, you're being dishonest, you say that you care about me, you say that you love me, you say these things, but then that isn't shown to me. And so what initially got me thinking about this idea is the realization that there are people in the world that do have love within them. We were created in the image of God. We were created for no other purpose more than to love and be loved by God primarily and by extension to others. We were created to love God and love one another. That is the fundamental characteristic of the human experience, is to love and be loved, which means love will naturally birth itself within us when we are drawn close to other people. But there are a lot of people in our world, because they have not had an interaction with the God of love, that just don't know how to do that. And I'm not talking about even Christian versus non-Christian, because God has poured his love so abundantly over mankind that the knowledge of what love means has permeated even beyond the borders of the church. And so what we understand as Christians is that as we are loved by God, that in turn teaches us how to love one another. That I love my wife as Christ loves the church. And so when I want to know, I say, I've got all of this love within me, I've got all of this feeling and all of this emotion towards my wife, but what do I do with that? How do I display that? The idea of opening the water bottle and actually making use of what's within it, I learned that from him. And so I look at the way that Christ lays himself down for me, and I then lay myself down for my wife. In the same way, my parents, as they raised me, looked at how God the Father laid himself down for Jesus and down for the church, and laid themselves down for me in the same way. And then as I grew up as a person, not only do I look to God as my father, but I look up to my earthly parents who raised me in a Christian home, who laid themselves down for me, and they essentially teach me how to open the water bottle to make use of what's inside of it. And so often we go through lives and we see people that have all kinds of resources inside of them, but they have no idea what to do with it or where to put it, okay? Now here's how this principle applies to Sabbath. We like to talk about our relationship with God, right? And we talk about our relationship with God, and you can imagine it even as a substance, right? Imagine your relationship with Jesus as a physical substance like water. And so what we do is we like to look at how many water bottles like this we have up on the wall in our cupboard. And we might look at it and you say, look, you can hold it up to the light and there's no discoloration in it, right? You can hold a white piece of paper behind it and it doesn't look blue or green. It's not discolored. There's no particles in it. Heck, you can put this water under a microscope and there's no bacteria. It is absolutely pure, clean, and we go on and on and on about how great this water is. And all of those things are true. This is great water. This is, this is Costco brand, so you know it's good. Purified water with minerals added for taste. There's even additional stuff in here. Let's see if it tells us where it comes from. I don't think it does. Nope, doesn't tell us. Well, some of the water tells you where it's from. But hey, we can go on and on about how good that water is, how clean it is, how pure it is, how wonderful it is, which is what, yeah, it does. What does it say? All right, so maybe Niagara Falls, or maybe they just wanted it to sound that way. But the point is, we can go on about this water and how wonderful it is in the same way that we often talk about our relationship with God as if it's a substance, which is a fair way to look at it. But the problem is, so many times we have this relationship, but it's bottled up and it's on a shelf. And so we can talk and we can know and we can have as much of that relationship, as much of that water as we want, but if we are not interacting with it, if it is kept separate from us, then it doesn't help us at all right? And so this is what I want to look at when we talk about Sabbath this year. Last year we talked about the principles and the heart of it and the relationship of it, but the reality is, if you never take the time to physically engage, which often just looks like physically engaging other things less, if you never create that space, then God is never going to interact with you. And so this year's Sabbath discussion for the next 4 weeks is going to talk a lot more about practical things. Practical things like creating time and creating space so that relationship can actually produce fruit in your life. Now, here's what I want to look at today. We're going to look at just a brief passage of Scripture to confront one of the biggest lies that gets in the way of Sabbath. We're going to look at Luke. Actually, we might be in Mark. Hold on. I marked a couple pages. I lost my page. We're gonna come back to that because I marked like 4 pages and can't find the one that I want. So what we're gonna look at is the way that Jesus interacts with other people and the way that he rests. As soon as I find it. Maybe we won't look at it. Well, I guess we're not going to look at it unless I find it while I talk. So here's what we look at. When we look at Jesus' ministry, is we look at the way that Jesus worked. There were so many times that Jesus is with people. I'm just going to summarize the story that we were going to preach because I'm really bad at finding things when I'm on stage. So Jesus is preaching and he's teaching the crowds, and they just keep following and following and following him. And really, you can look all throughout the New Testament and see examples of this, that when Jesus is in the midst of all these people, there are so many times that he dismisses the crowds and he goes away by himself to pray. And so the fundamental principle for today is this, that Jesus was constantly followed by people who needed him. And this is really a direct tie into what we talked about last week. If you weren't here last week, we talked about the difference. The main story was Jesus at the temple and what it is that makes Jesus different from us, what it is that made Jesus wise, and why do we separate ourselves from him. And the bottom line was that Jesus primarily viewed the spiritual before the physical, that Jesus primarily saw what was going on in people's hearts before he saw what was going on in their bodies. And so Jesus was always in this state where he was so aware of the spiritual warfare that was going on around him. And so just picture Jesus, and he's going through his ministry, and he is surrounded by crowds of people that are following him. And he's teaching them, and he's healing them of physical illnesses, and he's speaking to them, he's speaking life into their lives, he's giving them new identities. Now, often what gets in the way of us doing Sabbath is we just get so busy with so many good things. But remember, the first temptation that Jesus came up against when the devil tempted him in the desert was to turn stones into bread. Now, Jesus hadn't eaten for 40 days. He was hungry. He was famished. His body was really in rough shape after not eating. And we realize that there's nothing wrong with turning stones into bread. That's not a bad thing. It doesn't hurt anybody. It's not something that we would say is sinful. It seems like a good thing. And we talk about self-care, and you need to take care of yourself and look out for yourself. So why on earth would it be a problem for Jesus to create food for himself if he had the ability? And the problem was that good thing that he was prompted to do was prompted by Satan, that the good thing that he was prompted to do was not prompted of God, it was prompted of the devil. And as soon as we say yes to Satan once, we continue to do that. And so if you look at the rest of Jesus' ministry, he was constantly confronted with good things that he could do that he said no to. And this is where we really struggle, right? Because as much as we say we are saved entirely by the grace of God, we really like to prove how many good things we do. And one of the greatest things that gets in the way of Sabbath is Christians that are too busy doing good things to follow God's commandments. Because we see all of these people that we can help, all of these things that we can do. We see all of these good areas of the world that we can go into and serve in. But realistically, if we think about what Jesus went through, there is no way we can excuse our behavior because we have more to do than he did. Because picture Jesus, right? He's got hundreds or thousands of people around him. And Jesus, the scripture describes him as being able to know the hearts of man. And time again throughout the Gospels, Jesus looks at somebody, take for instance Zacchaeus. He looks at Zacchaeus and he immediately knows what it is that Zacchaeus needs. He knows Zacchaeus' burden, he knows his hurts, he knows Zacchaeus' insecurities, he knows all of that, which makes him able to speak into that and bring life into Zacchaeus' life. So imagine Jesus surrounded by thousands of people. And if you know any people, you know that every person has needs. Every person has insecurities. Every person has pain. Every person has trauma. Every person has things that they need God to heal. And so imagine Jesus surrounded by thousands of people, and every face in that crowd he looks at, he sees the pain, he sees the hurt, he sees the need for healing. Every person he looks at, he says, I know exactly what your theological issue is. I know what your disconnect is in your brain. I know exactly what I need to preach to get you to live a healthier life and turn your life around and stop throwing your life away the way you are. He sees that in every single person. He has the ability to understand that, and yet he says, that's enough for today. I need to leave. And he walks away from crowds full of hundreds of people whose needs he is aware of. People that he may know, you know what, if they leave now, they're not going to come back. This is maybe my only chance to speak to him, and yet he leaves. And so if Jesus can leave those hundreds of people to go up on a mountainside by himself to pray, to give himself a break, to give himself time of intimacy with God, not to just say, hey, God, you know what, you're just going to have to come speak to me while I heal these people. Not to say, you know what, God, there's a lot of people here that need a sermon, so why don't you just tell me what I need? Why don't you just replenish me while I preach today? Jesus even said, your issues are going to have to wait. Your pain is going to have to wait because this is a command. Because he recognized that we don't disobey one command of God in order to follow another. And you realize, because sometimes we forget, that keeping Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments. Not one of the 10 suggestions, right? Which we like to make some of them. One of the 10 commandments. It's up there with not murdering people. All right? So God wasn't messing around, and he wasn't trying to give us different degrees, different variations of how much he commanded these things. That Sabbath keeping, that remembering the Sabbath day and keeping it holy, two terms that we'll probably parse out later in this message series, is a commandment. And so we can really just simply say, God commands you to do this. And you wouldn't walk out this afternoon and go home and say, you know, God, I know that you commanded me not to murder people, but there's just these 2 or 3 guys, all right? There's just not everybody, all right? I'm not gonna kill all. How many weeks are in a year? 52. God, I'm not gonna kill all 52 people I know, but there's just these 3. And I really just, if they were gone, my life would just be so much easier. So hey. The other 49, I'm there. I'm not murdering anybody. I'm just going to murder these 3. We wouldn't do that, would we? No, we wouldn't try and justify, hey, I'm leaving 49 of them alive, and they're all obnoxious. Just these 3 are the worst, so we're only going to kill them. If anybody did that, just let me know, and we'll call the police. But we don't justify like that with murder. But we justify Sabbath. Even if we keep 49 weeks of Sabbath, which I would say is a stretch for most of us, we would say to God, hey, we only made plans 3 Sundays out of the year. We only kept ourselves busy from sunup to sundown on 3 Sabbaths. And hey, we have a busy schedule, God, and there's only 2 weekend days. We over and over and over justify breaking the Sabbath. And so, hey, I'm not one to talk about commandments, and you just have to do this a lot, but if nothing else, we've got to recognize that this was a command, church, not a suggestion. And we find so many other things to do to draw our focus away from him. And I like our message series from last year. I think it was important. I think it was an important starting point. But here's the problem. If we stay where we were last year, then we'll make anything into Sabbath in our minds. And we will use that to justify ignoring and disobeying the commands of God to rest, to stop, to take a break, because we have to self-justify ourselves by our actions. And we don't like to hear this, but if Jesus, who healed more broken people in 3 years than any of us can hope to do in a lifetime, if Jesus, who had crowds full of people that were broken and hurting, waiting to talk to him, if he could keep the command of God, then so can we. Here's the thing. God will never call you to do things that cause you to break his commandments. God will not call you to do things that bring about sin and sinful effects in your life that are not of him. So God doesn't call you to stressful situations. He calls you to situations of trust and obedience. God doesn't call you to hopeless situations. God calls you to hope even when it doesn't make sense. And so if you're finding yourself on this side, there's an issue. You're either doing something that God didn't call you to do, or the second you got the directive, you left him behind and went to do it yourself. God said, here's our mission. We're going to this place. We're going to do this thing. We're going to fight this battle. And you took off before he could follow you with his army. Those are the two things we do. We're fighting a war. The first thing we do is say, God, we need to attack over there. That spot right there is the key. Now, meanwhile, we're just foot soldiers. We have no idea of the game plan. We don't see the map with the little guys on it, right, that you see in all the war movies. We don't see the big picture. And we say, God, you've got to go there, and we just run that direction. And we don't understand the 5 places that we need to go before we get there. We just head out, and in the middle of the battle, we say, God, why are you not helping me? And God says, because I'm fighting this battle over there. Because that battle wasn't winnable yet, and you're wasting your time. That's the first thing we do. The second thing is God tells us we're going here. We're going to point A. And before he can finish giving the instructions, we've taken off. We've left him behind. And we're trying to do it by ourselves while he's still rolling up behind us, getting the tanks and the planes and everything else together to support us in what he's called us to do. And so if you find yourself burnt out, if you find yourself overwhelmed and stressed, my guess is one of those two things are happening. And the good news is Sabbath is the solution to both. Because what some of you need is to shut up and sit down for a little while. Especially Kim. What some of you need is to shut up and sit down for a little while to let God speak. Anybody have a child that you go to tell them what they're supposed to do? And before you can finish explaining to them what they're supposed to do, they've already started running out of the room to go finish it. All right? And you say, wait a minute, I haven't explained what you need to do. And they say, I know what to do, I know how to do it, I've done it before. And you say, no, you don't know how to do it. I'm not talking about you, Haley. I'm talking about my other 13-year-old daughter, 14-year-old daughter. And so you say, I need you to go outside and shovel the walkway. And then they immediately run and go to throw their stuff on, but you say, wait a minute, I need to explain something to you. And they say, no, I know how to do it, and they try to rush out the door. But what they don't understand is that the situation has maybe changed. That maybe I was about to say, and make sure you clean the snow off of the roof before you shovel the walkway because it's about to fall off. And they don't listen to that, and they go and they spend an hour and a half shoveling the walkway, and as they're walking back into the house, guess what? All that snow comes piling down, and they have to go shovel it again. Anybody have experiences like that with your children? We have experiences like that in our house. That our child assumes they know what we're talking about. They assume that they know everything that we know, but we see so much more than they do. You see, we do that with God all the time. That as soon as we sense, oh, God, you're calling me to go here, we just start running. He says, wait a minute. I want you to do that next year, not today. Or, hey, I want you to bring this other person with you, and they're not here yet because you can't do it alone. Because we don't make time for Sabbath. We spend so much time going, and we convince ourselves that we're just so important that we've got to do it because who else is going to? As many people are depending on you as we're depending on Jesus. And he left, and he took breaks often. And you can say, well, I don't need it, I'm fine. I can keep going. And we make ourselves into sacrificial martyrs because we just work so hard for God. But you realize that you're working hard in disobedience. That you're really working hard to sin against him if he's commanded you to do the opposite of what you're doing. So here's what we need to do this year. We've developed an understanding of what it means to have a relationship with him and to trust him and be in communion with him. Now you've got to create the space to do it. I'm not talking about mindset changes primarily. I'm not talking about attitudes. I'm talking about, will you do this? Here's step one for me. Rachel and I have kind of gone back and forth over the years about what Sabbath looks like, and I've taken Sabbath on Fridays and Thursdays. For me, I'm going to start taking my Sabbath on Sunday because that's what God commanded me to do. Now, I'm not saying that every pastor has to do this. This is just what God is calling to me right now, because what I've said in the past is, man, Sundays are hectic for me, and I get up, and there's all this stuff to do for church, and I have to make sure this is ready, and the bulletins, and this and that, and all of these things, and it's impossible for me to have a day of rest on Sunday. But it gets kind of tricky when we begin to use the word impossible to describe what God has called us to do. So here's where I'm at this year. I'm going to do what it takes, and I'm going to spend the month of January figuring out what I have to do to make Sunday a Sabbath. And I don't know what that looks like. I know a lot of it is going to be more preparation. It's going to be making sure things are done on Saturday, making sure that the bulletins are printed and folded and probably over here and ready to go so that I can wake up Sunday morning, have breakfast and coffee with my family, and at the same time as everybody else, come over here to go to worship practice and enjoy being in the presence of the Lord, and then go home when I'm done. Because, yeah, I have to stand up here and preach, but sometimes I think it's easier for me to stand up and talk than it is for you to sit there and listen.
It is.
So I'm going to make Sunday my Sabbath. And even that, I shouldn't say, I'm going to accept Sunday as my Sabbath, as God has commanded me to. And I'm going to find a way to make it work. Because if you read biblically, preparation day is huge for Sabbath. The day before Sabbath was a day of incredibly intentional work. Everything that Sabbath isn't, the day of preparation is. And so your Saturday should be Sabbath focused. Really, your Saturday should be usually what we make Sunday, that day to get everything done that you've been putting off all week, right? Not Saturday's your day to sit around and do whatever you want, and then all of a sudden on Sunday when it's God's day, well, we got to get this stuff done. You have to get it done because you didn't get it done on Saturday. And hey, guess what? If you can't get it all done on Saturday, then God wants to cross some stuff off your list. We are hoarders. Anybody ever seen those hoarding shows on TV? People just fill their house up with junk. We are time hoarders. We are schedule hoarders. We put every single piece of garbage that we can possibly cram into our schedules because we think it might be valuable. And God wants to come through and say, dumpster, dumpster, dumpster. You don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. Nope, that's completely unnecessary for my purposes. Nope, that's completely useless. That's a piece of garbage and it stinks. I don't even know why you have it in your schedule. Clear it. If you can't get it done on Saturday, don't do it. Intentionally make time for Sabbath this year. We're going to end today with communion. The reminder of God's presence here with us. And so when we take communion, it is a reminder of of the physical presence of God and the way that God so tangibly comes to be with us. We take communion not because there's anything magical about the bread or about the blood, but because it is a realization, it is a reminder of how close God wants to be with us. That when he says that he wants to be the blood of our covenant, he wants to be the bread of life, that he wants to spiritually nourish us just as tangibly, with as much experience as when we physically eat and drink. And so if we have a God who first came down to be with us on Christmas, and if we have a God who wants us to remember how tangibly he comes to be with us, I think it's important that we recognize the need for us to tangibly be with him. Because we don't have a God that said, well, I'm just going to be with you guys in spirit. He physically came to be with us. So this January, what are you physically going to do to be with him? What will you do physically to clear your schedule and make time to be with him the God who left heaven to be with you? Because if he left heaven to come down and live in this mess that we made, we can clear our Sunday schedules for him. If you would bow your heads. God, as we prepare to partake of this sacrament together, God, as we seek your presence, I pray that you be among us in this place. God, I'm looking for real, tangible ways in my life that you want to change me. Because, Lord, you didn't create the physical just to be unimportant. And God, the deeper into our body's psychology goes, the more we realize the significance and the importance of the things that happen to us physically. The more we learn about how our bodies work, the more we understand how emotional things that happen to us have major effects on us physically. And we also recognize, Lord, that our physical life affects our emotions and it affects our spirits as well. And so, God, let us not be people that serve you only by our spirits. Because if all we seek to do is serve you with our spirits, we neglect the commands that you've given us. And Lord, on our Sabbaths, we want to be intimate with you. We want to be close to you on a spiritual level. We want to commune with you. We want to have relationship with you. But Lord, we recognize that it was also a physical command to be still. Because it's so difficult to quiet our minds when our bodies are busy. We have so much that we want to run away from, so many insecurities, so many pains that we keep ourselves busy because that's where we're comfortable, but we cannot hear your voice through the clutter. And so, God, this year I pray that the clutter be lifted, that each and every one of us and all of our families, Lord, that we